functions that benefit from economies of scale and functions that need coordination. Whereas the functions that should sit at a more local level are functions that require accommodating variation and functions that require responding faster to local information, right? Because the other problem you get with centralization is just kind of the information flow is much weaker and the transmission back to decision making is much slower. Okay, so if you keep those first principles in mind, I think even before we go look at the pandemic response itself, one thing that people don't seem to generally understand is that in a cross-country setting, India is one of the most over-centralized federal countries in the world. Okay, so if you compare with other large countries like China, the US, or Brazil, or Indonesia, our local spending is about 3% of GDP, 3% of the budget, or 3% of GDP. I'm blanking on that, compared to say 25% or even 50% in other countries. Okay, so before blaming anybody for the reactions, I think it's important to say that in our DNA of governance, that we are deeply hierarchical and over-centralized, and there's a bunch of reasons for that which I won't get into. But I think the reason that's important is that the instinct of policymakers, right, is to over-centralize, and this is true not just from center to state; it's also true from state to local. Okay, so we have a very strong kind of centralizing instinct in our administrative structures, and so one of the ways I think this panned out is I think, we were probably suboptimally responding in both phases relative to these first principles. Okay, so I think, it's absolutely true that in 2020, in the fog of war, we were trying to kind of make decisions with limited data. And there was definitely a need for national coordination on a whole bunch of responses. There's no question about that, right? But it's not clear if you needed a national uniform lockdown based on the first principles of federalism, mainly because, as Dr. Reddy said, this is already known to be primarily an urban situation, primarily an urban issue. And so what you were doing with that kind of blanket lockdown was the costs of something like that are just enormous in terms of what that did to livelihoods in low density areas where the cases may be low. And the other interesting thing, like Dr. Reddy mentioned, is that because this was done under the kind of Disaster Management Act or under the, it became an issue that was a home ministry issue as opposed to a health ministry issue, right? So which meant that when you went down to the field, a lot of the response was seen as a law enforcement issue, that you had cops on the road trying to put people back in, as opposed to a public health issue. And the way you would respond to a public health issue is very, very different from the way you would respond to what is it, law enforcement. So I think, so on federalism, I don't want to blame anybody, right? It's just more a reflection of the fact that the instinct of our administrative structure is to over-centralize, and you saw severely the cost of that.